Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today and welcome. We're going to get started. And just a heads up, if I or any of us disappear, it might be because of the blizzard, but we have backup plans in place if that does happen. My name is Noura. I'm Al-Shabaka's U.S. Policy Fellow and the host of our Policy Lab series. So for today's discussion, we wanted to grapple with a claim that many of us have been hearing a lot lately, and that's the claim that the so-called rules-based international order is dead, or even going as far as saying international law itself is dead. These declarations come after 2 years of genocide in Gaza, the first genocide that was live streamed for the world to witness in real time, and arguably the first truly globalized genocide in the sense that we've seen the complicity and even outright participation by countries and corporations and individuals around the world. So, what Gaza has made painfully clear to us is the promise that never again, which my generation at least was taught to actually believe actually meant something, was never really meant to apply equally to everyone. And the same can be said, arguably, of international law and the system of rules of the quote unquote rules based order. So now, as the Trump administration makes no effort to hide its intention to scrap whatever remains of this order and the infrastructure that has sustained it all this while, in favor of more overt mechanisms of power projections, what we're left with a set of urgent questions that we want to answer today. So, was the system that we're now writing obituaries for ever truly based on rules and law? If it could not or would not stop a genocide, what role did Gaza play in exposing that reality or in accelerating this paradigm shift? And as the US, kind of once this self proclaimed leader of this international liberal paradigm casts it aside, what kind of order is taking shape in its wake? So, to answer these questions and more, I'm joined by Noura Erakat and Jake Romm. Noura is a human rights attorney and professor at Rutgers University. She is the co founder of Jadaliya and author of Justice for Some Law and the Question of Palestine. Jake is a writer and lawyer currently based in New York City, and he's the US representative for the Hind Rajab Foundation. So before we dive in, just a quick reminder about the format. I'm going to be posing questions to Jake and Noura for the first 45, 50 minutes or so. And then we're going to get into, we're going to save 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions from you, from the audience. So please leave your questions in the Q&A box, should be either to the right or to the bottom of your screen. And remember, you can upvote questions that you find most interesting, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So, Noura, I wanna start with you. Just last week we witnessed the first meeting of Trump's Board of Peace, which was at one point many people I think expected to kind of just be the Trump administration's colonial overseer of Gaza. But has since kind of ballooned into something much bigger, into more of a systemic challenge to the international rules-based order, and more specifically to the UN, right? With Trump, not just the US, Trump himself kind of at the head. And I think this is really interesting because it kind of makes it clear that Gaza really is this breaking point, or this point of rupture between this old system and what the US is now at least attempting to force upon us. But first, I think the first question I want to ask you is, we throw around these big exclamations and we hear these big claims, and I kind of just wanted to get your thoughts on them, your kind of like candid response to them up front, and if kind of tell us a little bit about what you think, what you understand international law and this international order to have been, right? And now we're talking about it being dead or whatever. Kind of, give us an idea of what you think it really meant and whether it was actually rules based to begin with.
Thank you so much, Tariq. It's an honor to be here with you and with Jake. I want to just, applaud Al-Shabaka for over a decade and a half now, forwarding Palestinian analysis as a way to step in and basically inform and shape the conversation, as opposed to, constantly being the passive objects of other people's analysis and visions and desires. I think that that's very evident in this moment, as the Palestinian analysts are completely absent from the mainstream conversation that's ongoing in this moment, but it's also very blatantly absent even from, what happens in Gaza. And I think that's the primary point, that what we're seeing here is what if the genocide in Gaza was the destruction of the Palestinian people through outright physical elimination and creating the means that don't sustain life. Right now we're seeing that further erasure, juridically and otherwise. And so thank you, Al-Shabaka. Let me answer your question in several parts. So one is kind of a big overview, thinking about international law and the rule-based order. The other one is thinking about the U.S. at the United Nations and its relationship to internationalism, and then getting us to this particular juncture of what that means. So on the first one, I think that we need to distinguish between rules-based order and international law. A rules-based order can simply be following rules that aren't necessarily negotiated by multiple states on a multilateral level that would constitute international law, subject to the negotiation of treaties, or subject to the creation of custom through state practice and what states believe is legal. In that case, there's an actual process that creates what we know as international law, and how then relationship between states and individuals and other organizations is governed. Rule-based is a reference to rules that are created by different institutions, and we've seen the United States forward this analysis of, we do have a rules-based order. The U.S. has seen itself as a police force for the rest of the world, as opposed to one of 193 states in the world, asserting itself as the police, because there is no coercive enforcement authority outside of Chapter 7 authority, which then would be subject to the Security Council veto. The U.S. has basically insisted that it can determine how and when and what is done, as long as it has certain standards. So first and foremost, they might actually continue rules-based, but those rules aren't necessarily mediated in the same way that international law would and its governance. Okay, so that said, even if it were, international law at its core, right, provides a structure of oppression. International law and its inception from the mid 15th century in informal colonization of the African coast, and then formal colonization of indigenous lands. In that moment, we see international law between states developed in the service of mitigating conflict between imperial powers that are trying to extract resources and lay claim to them. That structure of international law never dissipates, and we see these horrible seeds when we see, for example, the usurpation of indigenous sovereignty. We see it when the idea of European sovereignty is defined by its denial to native peoples. We see it also when Haiti in 1804 achieves sovereignty, the second state in the Western Hemisphere after the United States to achieve sovereignty, and yet, unlike the United States, is punished and continues to be punished because it challenged chattel slavery as a form of property. And that here we see the principle of property override the principle of democracy very blatantly in a way that continues in the present. Now, that would lead one to believe, well, then we should destroy international law. But what happens is that a third world majority is able to use international law to its advantage from 1955 onwards, in what we know as the Third World Revolt, where they, either national armed liberation movements together with newly independent sovereigns across the third world consolidate their force militarily, economically, and politically to establish a third world majority at the United Nations, where now they're creating the law itself and using it in really strategic ways. It's that moment that the U.S., this is when, for example, the Palestinian Liberation Organization achieves its juridical recognition at the United Nations in 1974. This is when we see Zionism be condemned as a form of racism and racial discrimination in 1975. This is when we see this third world majority establish how guerrilla fighters are not criminal, but are actually soldiers with the right to fight, and therefore legislate the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions 1 and 2 in order to regulate that fighting and recognize them as legitimate soldiers. This is all victory, and it's using international law. But what we have to be clear here is it's not the law that's doing the work, it's political power that's doing the work. In this moment, the US realizes that it can no longer control the United Nations, and we see a steady distance, a steady lessening of significance of the United Nations. And now we have, the present, where these contradictions, right? The racism and in international law that was otherwise, masked or could be maneuvered is now on full display. Palestine exposed it fully. Palestine exposed that glitch, exposed that racism, made the past into the present, is illuminating that the world is still colonized, separated from a global south and a global north, where might makes right. We see that in Palestine. So it's not that Palestine is the exception, is that Palestine kind of, the ruse is up, right? Where we see these states all of these states willingly, in their provision of arms, in their facilitation of genocide, we see them willing to destroy what minimal guardrails existed to protect people in order to facilitate this genocide, right? Now, and those guardrails are gone. I mean, that's in order to rescue what might remain of the relevance of international law, it means rescuing it in Palestine, right? Through atonement, reparations, tribunals, accountability, self-determination of Palestinians, building for themselves. There's no way around this. If it was destroyed in Palestine, it must be rebuilt in Palestine for the rest of the world. What is the BOP? The BOP is a bit like the rest of what we see in Gaza, which is we see people who in Gaza the whole world is primed for death, destruction, media collusion, heads of state who are literally not responding to their popular bases, right? So we see all of this, and now we see how because it's normalized, it can be expanded. Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and so on. But the BOP is actually like that, a seed for something far more detrimental beyond Palestine. Not only are they trying to supplant any kind of, international multilateral resolution for Palestinians, when Trump assumes the head of this BOP and now can assume tenure for life and now can have people, states buy in a lifetime membership, they're also making a bid to supplant the United Nations as the primary authority in the international system. And so it's, this is a much bigger bid. If you notice the BOP, if you read their establishing charter, it's not specific to Palestine. It's not specific to Gaza, right? And so here we have the seeds of something far bigger, where I think, it's more accurate to say what is going on, where we have, this melding of anarcho-capitalists and states, right, who are colluding in order to basically, kind of fulfill this Milton Friedman fantasy of eviscerating political democracy in order to provide for unfettered market expansion. The market is hindered by popular democracy. The market is hindered by people who want the right to vote and housing and education and healthcare and environmental standards. And so here is that bid where we're going to see what I think this bid is much, much bigger. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Noura. I think I kind of want to stay on the point you said of the distinction between Palestine and beyond Palestine. And Jake, maybe I'll direct this at you, but Noura, kind of what you're saying is that the shift that we're seeing, it feels kind of it feels in a way as inevitable as part of the infrastructure of the international order that has been in place for decades, right? This shift. And Jake, I guess I want your thoughts on why, I guess, what role Gaza played in exposing this, or why it was Gaza that we feel like exposed it, and whether it was Gaza that exposed it. How much of this is can like I think it's important to ask how much of this can be focused on Palestine and beyond Palestine. And because there's been multiple points in history, in recent history, from the U.S. Atrocities committed in Vietnam to Iraq. So I'm wondering, just like what about this point in time stands out? Was it Gaza that really tipped the scales, or was this potentially even inevitable with the return of the second Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, I think Noura hit the nail on the head, predictably. And also, I want to say thank you guys, at Al-Shabaka, for having me so much, and it's really an honor to be doing this with you, Tarek, and Noura. But I mean, really hit the nail on the head that this was like I think the inevitable outcome of this long unfolding dialectical process that starts, let's say, pin it at 1945, right? End of World War II. We have the inauguration of the liberal international order as we know it. And two things are occurring at once and in opposite directions. On the one hand, you have the setting up of international institutions, which are premised on the promise of, basically a world without aggression, of mediating conflicts now between states through diplomacy, through actions at international fora where states can get together in theory as equals, right? As equals before the law, which is what international law promises in its theoretical outlook. And at the same time, you have the United States as basically the guarantor of the system, as Noura said. And the system, it can function relatively smoothly as long as U.S. power remains unchallenged, right? Because the U.S., as Noura said, is the guarantor of the system and sets itself above it in a way. And not just in the sense of it being on the Security Council, which has this kind of executive power in international law to a certain extent, but the U.S. sets itself above the Security Council as well. The U.S. is a global empire and is more or less not subject to the very laws that it claims to champion. But it's still, insofar as it was interested in maintaining some kind of hegemony, which is that extra buy-in over domination, right? Of convincing people that your domination is actually in their best interest. It does need to play the international law game. And that does provide certain opportunities for other states and non-state actors as well to at least speak the same language as power and make imminent critiques of it, and in that way kind of shape behavior. And it has a regulatory function, a very weak regulatory function, as we've seen. I mean, post-45 has seen just like atrocity after atrocity after atrocity, largely committed by the United States and Israel. But still, there is an emancipatory kernel there that we can't lose sight of, which is that, and this is also kind of what is the undoing of the system, which is that because the system more or less functioned to preserve U.S. hegemony, which meant allowing states to assume this kind of international legal personality, at least in a formal way, and also because U.S. empire was premised on opening up the world to market penetration, you do have states that become, as a result of this, economically and politically viable in a way they weren't before. And let's remember, in 1945, there were a small fraction of the states we have now, right? And what we've seen through this long process is more and more states kind of assuming a legal and international political, diplomatic, economic personality that they did not have before. And once that happens, then U.S. hegemony can kind of be challenged a little more, right? Like what is the U.S. offering to the world now that it was offering in 1945? 1945, if you're a Western capitalist country, it's offering you a good deal. It's saying we're going to rebuild your states after the calamity of World War II, and we're going to create this international institution that will be a safeguard of peace, and we're going to keep a check on the Soviet Union, which all of you Western states are very afraid of, right? That world is over, though, right? That world is ended, probably around the time of Reagan, but like really definitely once the Soviet Union was out of the picture, and the U.S. was really feeling its oats as an unchallenged global empire. And so, we moved to, as you mentioned, there were all these horrible atrocities that happened under the auspices of this order when we thought it was alive, but those atrocities are just the contradictions within the order becoming known, right? And contradictions ultimately do need to come to a head. And then it becomes a crisis. And then once it's a crisis, then those contradictions can no longer be resolved within the current system itself. And I think, the so-called global war on terror was when these contradictions really started becoming super visible and unignorable on the world stage. I mean, the war on terror, so-called, right, was a lot of things, but in addition to the violations of the law of war and just the U.S.'s global torture program and the chipping away of civil liberties, in the United States, but also around the Western world and elsewhere, it was also a massive and global and constant violation of sovereignty that we kind of have not seen before. It was the U.S. really saying, yeah, states might have sovereignty vis-a-vis one another, but not vis-a-vis us. We are a global empire, and you are a frontier for us, and you are either a obedient vassal or a restive province. But either way, we reserve the right to go in at any time. And part of that stems from, a change in the conception of the rule of law of war to combat these, quote unquote terrorist groups, which look a lot like the guerrilla groups of the past. And, some legal justifications that we saw through Vietnam were revived and are certainly being used again in Gaza. I mean, like the U.S. had kind of a policy of they'd blow up a village, kill everyone there, and then say something like, "Oh, but there were Viet Cong there, and so it was a legitimate target." Or we found some guns that we in many cases planted, and therefore it was a legitimate target. And all these civilians who died, what a tragedy! But they were human shields for the Viet Cong, or they knew the risks and they were there. I mean, these kind of like bombing in international law is like a technology of colonial domination has been around for a while. But anyway, sorry, I got off track here. But the point I'm trying to make is that the global war on terror kind of pushed these things, I think, these contradictions to the fore in a way that they hadn't been before. And we saw still, though, with like Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States really cared still about legal legitimacy. They cared about international legitimacy. I mean, for the first Iraq war, it was largely paid for by the US's international partners, and they assembled this coalition. They tried to do the same thing with the second Iraq war, but no one was really buying it, and it was a failure. And I think that they went ahead and did it, and there was no consequence. They were like, okay, we don't need this hegemony thing anymore. It was nice to have, but we really don't need it anymore, and we don't want it, because now it is nothing but a hindrance, and we can get by on brute force alone. And the Israelis have always been a junior partner in that project, right? I mean, talk about people who at once, speak out both sides of the mouth of international law. Of course we follow it. And then also there's no such thing and it doesn't apply to us. And I mean, Noura, your book very wonderfully articulates the way in which they have been, crafting all of these sui generis legal ideas and legal legitimations to maintain what is otherwise fundamentally a illegal occupation, illegal massacres, et cetera, et cetera. But the reason, anyway, so that's the long trajectory of getting us to the moment now. But the reason I think Gaza is like such a flashpoint, and why this kind of death knell would really only be heard in Palestine in the way it is Israel is and always has been kind of an anachronism, right? If the international legal order comes up at this time in which states are starting to decolonize themselves, these people are rising up and creating new states out of the ashes of empire, right? At the same time that is happening, Israel is being created as this colonial entity, as this expressly colonial entity, right? And so it is, in a way, like by the same institutions that are ostensibly supposed to be doing decolonization or smoothing the process for it, right? And so it is, in a way, this kind of like the bad conscience of the international legal order is Israel. It is this stain that has persisted underneath the international order and been allowed to access it and be a part of it, even as it kind of exists as a pre-45 type entity, as this colonial entity, as an entity premised on like racial supremacy or ethnic religious supremacy, however you want to qualify it, that engages in routine violation of the laws of war that were set up after World War II, that routinely violates the sovereignty of its neighbors, has expansionist goals, engages in aggression regularly, right? Like this is exactly what was not supposed to happen. And it became so integrated into like the Western imperial project that now that we see it in this very acute phase of its genocide of the Palestinians, it has, in a way that the US conscripted the rest of the world for its torture program and for the global war on terror, it has kind of like pushed people to take a side, right, in the West. Like, are we going to try to make the international legal order true for the very first time, which means we must vociferously oppose Zionism and also US empire? Or are we going to allow the crime of crimes, the worst thing that can happen, and not only allow it, but support it? Because to not support it in a very like quote war on terror logic is you're either with us or against us. To not support it is to fall under the evil eye of the United States, for lack of a better phrase. And so it really like it pushes these contradictions to the fore. It is kind of the lie at the core of the international system. And to the extent that it is continuing to be allowed to happen, it is signaling like, okay, this colonial, this colonial core of the world system that we can't acknowledge is now not only being forced to be acknowledged, but now is the principle itself. Now domination and aggression, which we were supposed to have gotten rid of, that is now the law. And Israel does, through its actions, create new law. And to the extent that the Americans and whoever else look at what's going on in Gaza and says, oh, that's legal, well, that can become new law. But basically, it's the crime becomes the principle of the new world order that we are maybe being ushered into. And everything that we had previously been told was sacred is being revealed to be a lie by this place that always gave lie to it in this way.
Thanks, Jake. I think so. I think the way you painted this gradual process of both like countries like the U.S. and Israel over time realizing that they don't necessarily need international, or they like the example you gave of the Iraq War. The first Iraq War, the U.S. made a lot of effort to get a bigger coalition on board, and the second, they realized that they don't need it to get away with what they want to do strategically. So I guess what I'm thinking about now, and maybe Noura, we can come back to you on this one. But as the world, not just the US, I think other countries are kind of following this trend too, but as the US and the world kind of no longer even bothers with the pretense of international law, or no longer even pretends to need to abide by it or take it seriously, how do we use international law as kind of a discursive tool? Kind of going back to Noura, what you said in the beginning about, it's not the international law that changes things, it's the people that deploy it in a way that is effective. So moving forward with this new world that is being constructed, how do we use international law and the language of it as a tool in our wider toolbox of resistance?
Yeah. Do you mind? I'm going to do a little bit of a professorial thing and just respond to 8%. Okay. I agreed completely. I just wanted to add a few notes, which is to say, one of the people want to know, I mean, this is not the first time that the U.S. Is evading international law and making a mockery of it. I mean, what we're seeing in Venezuela, what we see in Gaza, what we're seeing in Cuba, right? But we saw so vividly in Iraq in 2003. I'll distinguish that from Afghanistan because in Afghanistan, there was some sort of attempt to get a UN Security Council resolution that recognized that the US had a right to self-defense, but in Iraq, they didn't. And it was revealed that there were no WMDs and there's never been accountability, right? And so Mandy Turner has a wonderful new policy memo out with Security in Context where she says, look, we've seen this in Iraq, but the primary difference there is that Iraq's sovereignty was never challenged. So the US, right, used this warfare for outright, just pillaging Blackwater, Halliburton, these other corporations that were outright pillaging, destroyed Iraq, creates the conditions for ISIS because of a lack. But the difference is that Iraq's sovereignty was never questioned. And so they revert to a sovereign state in a way that Palestine is not going to benefit from because that sovereignty is not acknowledged. And here is being, there's actually a bid to destroy it once and for all. And they can't. Because of Palestinian resistance. That's the primary reason they can't, because Palestinians have refused to surrender and continue to resist. And in fact, are showing the world absolutely what's necessary. There's no way to turn over here and get, a good deal. This is about, beating people into submission. So another point here is about like this difference. Why is the U.S., if this has always been the same, then what's different? Here I'm going to point to Aziz Rana's work, legal scholar, constitutional law, who points out to us that in this post-World II order that Jake, signaled to, that in that order, the U.S. not only promised reconstruction, but almost also promised political democracy, right? In order to expand capitalism as a primary form of economic governance, promised that it came with political democracy. Well, once they emerge, victorious in the Cold War, why make that promise anymore? When they can just roll out this economic governance and roll back the promise of political democracy, which is why we see, there's just constant ramping up of what, Jake describes as a loss of hegemony. And the only thing I want to say about the loss of hegemony is, despite the fact that we see such an ugly face of it because it's just crude, it's violent, it's grotesque. We're watching the US, beat other nations into submission by starvation, genocide, threat of regime change as they're negotiating, right? And I want to point out to our viewers that is a sign of weakness, not strength. That is like the ultimate, this is like this is it. If you can't get legitimacy and buy-in and all you have is this coercive force, I would just take with a grain of salt that that's a sign of weakness. So anyways, let me stop there on the commentary and move to the question, well, what of law? If we know all of this, so what of law? So I'm, as I shared before, well before October 2023, well before this genocide that we witnessed, live stream that is ongoing, I'm part of a tradition of third world approaches to international law, which never understood the law as a side of, universalism, noble rights for everybody. No one's above the law, right? And yet at the same time, you see me and you might hear me and you see me write, using the language of law. So what's that about? And here, there's two things that I'll say. One thing that I'll say is that if I'm addressing an audience in the global South, I don't need to use the language of international law to tell you the story of Palestine. I just need to say colonialism and people understand, okay, that's bad. And people have a right to resist it. I can say dignity. I can say justice. I can say land rights, right? And people understand that with, their whole being because they're descendants. Even when I go to other former colonial powers, like Portugal and Spain and the Netherlands, there's even there, as much as there's amnesia, at least a little bit more than people in the United States might understand it. Why then use the language of international law among, Western audiences nonetheless? And there it's to point out a contradiction. There it's to point out the contradiction of their commitment to universalism, of their commitment to what they, their Enlightenment principles of equality, which I don't think are ever true. But it's a discursive mechanism used to highlight the contradiction in amongst those states. It's not used necessarily to establish what Palestinians deserve and need, which doesn't need the language of law to make clear, right? And so that's what's going on there. Had those audiences already agreed that Palestinians were human, right? Their rights wouldn't be in contest. And so the work there is really exposing that contradiction and a reminder that racism is always playing a role, certainly with Palestinians, but certainly with all peoples as well. The fact that for these Western states, they don't recognize genocide as, a crime against humanity and as a crime in general, and legislated as a crime until it happens within Europe's shores, should tell you everything about the role that racism is playing in this construction of an international order. So how do we use it now? I think now it's, again, it's exhausting its relevance as a tool. It's continuing to highlight that contradiction. It's continuing to demonstrate, frankly, the bankruptcy of the norms of Western civilization as insufficient to guide us through this moment. In fact, they are the norms of Western civilization that have made this moment possible, right? They're the ones that have disregarded the law, the many tools we have available. Those 1977 protocols that I mentioned would regulate an irregular combat between a people fighting for their national liberation, right? Which Hamas and other Palestinian groups squarely fit in as nascent sovereigns, right? And a state actor. This could have been regulated. The accusation of human shielding, of proportionality, of distinction, of when you're supposed to, not pursue military action, all there. But it was a refusal even to go to those laws of war because of an insistence that somehow Palestinians fighting for their rights as being represented by a group that used Islam as part of its political framework now fit in an entire new category of barbarism, savagery, outside the law altogether. And so, this is, you even hear me doing it here, right? How am I using the law in order to, push these boundaries and push these contradictions? Now I don't want you to necessarily battle with me on, the definition of terms. I want you to explain to me why Hamas didn't qualify, why Palestinians don't qualify for those regulations of warfare, right? How do Palestinians have the right to self-defense? What options are available to them? What of the principle of self-determination? And this is a mechanism to basically try to pivot foot forward in order to change the conversation and get off our defensive back foot. This is only effective, however, as we demonstrate our collective power. Doing this merely discursively makes for really nice footnotes, but will not be efficacious unless we can demonstrate our collective power. We saw that during Third World Revolt, when the Third World majority was not just a majority at the UN, but it was up in arms across the globe. And so the only way we're going to see this also have that, also have that efficaciousness is when we see that power. And we see some of it when we see the Hague Group, for example, consolidate its power. We see it, for example, when we see other formations across the global south. We see it when South Africa insists on going to the ICJ despite all threats. All of those things are going to be necessary. When we on our own use the action in order, to participate in boycott, divestment, and sanctions and protests in a refusal of recognition, you cannot rely on the law to do the work without building the power necessary to make the law relevant at all.
I think that's a great transition to my next question for Jake, because I want to know a little bit more about your work with the Hind Rajab Foundation and how that foundation and how that work is kind of doing what Noura said. How is it translating, legal arguments into actual power, both by utilizing international law as a framework, but also tapping into domestic law and making an appeal to domestic authorities to take action and hold their own citizens accountable or Israeli soldiers accountable when they're traveling in their countries.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I just want to jump in on something Noura said quickly, which is that before answering stuff, the law is not going to save us. The law is not the tool that will save us. It's not the tool that sets people free. It's not the tool that liberates them. The people themselves do that. And especially in a world where the powers that are supposed to uphold the law or that claim to uphold the law are disregarding it and reverting to pure domination, then that has to be met with counterforce, right? And there is this tension where you have quote unquote systemic actors like the United States or Israel, right, who are dismantling the international system. And then you have counter systemic actors like Hamas, Ansar Allah, Hezbollah, right, which are exerting exactly the kind of force which is required to make the international system actually true, right? You can't have an international system that works as a check on power, as a series of laws, insofar as it's dominated by the United States or any other kind of colonial entity. You can have it if you force these powers to come to the table. And so these counter-systemic actors we can reconceptualize them as the actually only systemic actors in the world right now. The only ones who are looking at the system and saying, there's maybe something worth preserving here, as long as we can access it, that we demand for the first time that the rule of law actually be a thing. And the only way to do that is through this kind of guerrilla warfare. But anyway, so to the HRF, how does our work? So we, I think there's maybe a misconception about our work sometimes, right? Which is that people think of us as doing international law. And that is like kind of true, right? I mean, the statutes and treaties that we are referencing are things like the Genocide Convention, the Geneva Conventions, et cetera, et cetera. But as we've seen, I mean, throughout history, but especially throughout, you know, the past few years, like international justice in terms of international mechanisms like the ICC or the ICJ move really, really slowly and are deeply under-resourced and really subject to political meddling because of those problems. That, you know, this genocide, like all others before it, is a really vast logistical, military, political undertaking. In the case of Israel, it has mobilized more or less the entire society around this shared goal. Not in the sense of like a directive of everyone needs to now go do this, but kind of a group affinity of like we all realize what needs to be done here, which is we need to commit genocide against the Palestinians and kind of solve this problem of Zionism once and for all. And everyone is embarking on that in their own special way, right? And not only has it mobilized basically all of Israeli society, it's also mobilized much of Western society in support of it. Or not society, I should say Western governments in support of it. Because largely people in the West are against this, which reveals, you know, the lie that we are living in some kind of actual representative democracy, particularly as it pertains to foreign policy. But, you know, the people who are sending arms to Israel, people who are supplying intelligence, doing logistics work, they're also guilty of international crimes. They're also guilty of aiding and abetting genocide. And there's precedent for this, right? There's legal precedent for holding these people accountable. We saw it in Nuremberg, I think like the Bruno Tesch case, which the individual who was supplying Zyklon B to the SS was convicted of aiding and abetting, I think it was war crimes in that case. And the idea, his defense was like, oh, I just want to make a profit. And then Doug Castle, this legal scholar at Northwestern, I think, has this really good article about, he calls dual intent, which is, okay, you wanted to make a profit. Well, the only way you could make money is if the killing continued. So you also wanted the killing to continue. And that is a legal standard that I think we could easily apply here to arms companies like Raytheon or any other group that still, you know, basically does any kind of commerce with Israel, and particularly with its military. There's also precedent with it much more recent in the Netherlands. This guy Van Anraat was convicted for aiding and abetting war crimes because he sold dual-use chemicals to Saddam Hussein, which he should have known or did know were going to be turned into chemical weapons, which were then used to gas the Kurds in Iraq. And, you know, once again, this was I just want to make money, and the court wasn't hearing it, right? So the point I'm making here is that there are so many people who are committing crimes right now, right? Not just in Israel, but around the world, who are like legally complicit in this crime against the Palestinian people. And the ICC simply is not equipped to take account of that massive number of perpetrators, right? And something that might be equipped in the international legal system would be a special tribunal, something like the ICTY, the ICTR that were set up after Yugoslavia or after Rwanda. But crucially, those need to be set up by the Security Council. And who's on the Security Council? The United States. And that's not going to happen because so many people who would need to come before that doc are US citizens, are US government officials, are US arms dealers. So, you know, international legal mechanisms, they have a role to play. And, you know, something like the ICC arrest warrants against Netanyahu, these are good things that have happened. And the ICJ case for genocide, that is a very good thing that has happened. But international law is not going to be the site of accountability, right? That needs to be states themselves. And part of this is that states are the people who create international law. They're the authors of international law. They're the subjects of international law. But they're also very crucially the enforcers of international law. The ICC issues the warrants. Great. Who has to arrest Netanyahu? It has to be a state authority. There's no international authority that can do that. And so, you know, states need to really turn themselves into sites of accountability. And they've already made a progress towards doing this, which is if you look at something like the Genocide Convention, it requires states to incorporate it into their own domestic laws to provide for the punishment of this crime. And basically every state has done that. The United States has done that. And it's almost just word for word what the genocide statute is, right? You look at Geneva Convention, Article 146, in the Fourth Geneva Convention. All states have an affirmative obligation, like a duty, to seek out people who have been alleged to done grave breaches of the convention within their territory without regards to nationality and investigate them and bring them to justice. I mean, that is an affirmative duty to exercise universal jurisdiction within your borders according to your own laws. And that exists already in international law. And that exists also in domestic law in almost all of these countries. The United States, even, an institution that is profoundly hostile to international institutions, particularly international criminal law, has incorporated the Genocide Convention, and it provides for universal jurisdiction, right? It is also incorporated in some way that aspect of the Geneva Convention. We have something called the War Crimes Act. It's a great law. It allows the United States to try people who have perpetrated war crimes, not just grave breaches of the Geneva Convention, but also breaches of the Hague Conventions, which maybe the only states still using those, without regard to nationality, right? Like these tools exist on the books in basically every state. These tools that are meant to give international law teeth. And so the only problem that we're facing is not a legal one. It's not, oh, these states, we don't know what to do. We wish we could do something. It's like, no, you have the tools on the books. It's a matter of political will, right? And so what we do when we file cases in national jurisdictions is really try to point out that contradiction and heighten that contradiction. And I want to be clear, like we demand and we expect and we want all of these states to actually undertake these prosecutions. But we also know that the law moves slowly. I mean, our organization's only been around for like a year and a half, 2 years, right? And it's, I think, fair to say this is like an iterative process that as we file these cases against more and more people, and we are trying to file them against as many perpetrators as they are, which is a massive, massive amount, tens and tens of thousands. We do a few things. One, we show people that these tools are actually on the books, and this is a discrete demand that you can make of your governments around the world. That, okay, we didn't know that you were allowed to do this. Now you have to do it. Oh, you have an international legal obligation to do it. And also, as the population of your country, which largely against the genocide in Gaza, that's an acute political demand that can be made. And I think that the work of doing the filings brings that into people's consciousness. It also, I think, helps tell the story of the genocide. As Noura was saying, when you talk to people in many Western countries about these, larger structural issues like colonialism, racism, apartheid, their eyes just glaze over, right? They're not. It's not really in the consciousness in the same way it is in the global South. But one thing that the West is particularly America, really, really good at understanding is kind of the language of criminal law in an individual sense, right? That like if you can interpolate these problems as legal problems, as opposed to large structural problems, as political problems, then you can make it cognizable to an audience which might not otherwise understand what is happening. If you can point to a guy and say, okay, he committed this war crime on this day at this time against these people. He committed genocide because he did this. Then that becomes, oh, that guy is a criminal in the ordinary sense of the word. I understand that. And I'm against criminality. I believe in the law. So something ought to be done here, right? But if you just stop there, then that can actually be a very depoliticizing move, which is not what we're trying to do. That the law, because it has to respond to violations and it has to respond to violations on an individual basis, that can depoliticize things. It can move you from thinking of these, questions of colonialism, questions of domination, into thinking of, okay, that's a discrete violation. Let's get that guy. Our work here is done. But what I think our work does when we file all of these cases around the world at the same time, and when we always contextualize in these filings that, this man may have committed the war crime of destruction of civilian property without a military purpose when he recorded a video of himself blowing up someone's apartment, right? Well, that's also the crime of genocide. That's also taking place in this larger genocidal context. That is also the crime or the constituent act of genocide of, trying to create conditions of life to bring about the destruction of the group and whole or part, right? And so when you can do this around the world, and I think it must be global really to work, you start to, from this individualizing act of the law, create a composite picture. A composite picture that points to not just a few bad apples, right? But really that the entire Israeli campaign is criminal and could not be anything but criminal because the aims are criminal, because the aims are genocide. And that composite picture, that pointillist picture that emerges, I think repoliticizes the law in the way that Noura was talking about, which is that it is a tool on the one hand to get accountability for specific actors, but it is also a tool to, create a narrative and to speak the language of these institutions which are perpetrating this genocide and heighten those contradictions. And so I really, there's this one quote I like to bring up every time I talk about this, from this article by Rob Knox, who is this incredible legal scholar. And he's talking about like how can we use international law? Like if we're Marxists, if we're leftists, what can we do to use international law, which is fundamentally bourgeois law, right? And he, in the last few pages, he quotes from Slavoj Žižek, of all people, who has this wonderful line about how if you make the right demand at the right time and insist on it unconditionally, it can, even though it is not itself a revolutionary demand, be a stand-in for revolution. And when I think of our own work, what I mean by that is if we insist, again, unconditionally, and we do insist unconditionally, that these states undertake these prosecutions, go and arrest these Israeli perpetrators, both their own nationals who are doing it and traveling soldiers around the world. If we insist on this unconditionally, that is itself a very discrete demand. That is within the purview of the law as it currently exists. But if states were to do that, particularly if they were to do it en masse, that would signal really for the first time that there is such a thing as an international rule of law, that there is an idea of international law with teeth outside US domination. And that is a revolutionary vision, right? That doesn't get us all the way, I think, to where we want to go, right? But it is a crucial step, a crucial first step. And so, that is really how I see our work, of this unconditional demand for justice that in itself contains a vision of a better world.
Thought before you jump in, and I know we don't have a lot of time and I want to give time to some questions that you're gathering. Let me just add real quick on a point that Jake made at the top of the conversation around, also this doesn't work unless, the law is going to apply to Ansarullah and Hamas and otherwise. In 2014, Hamas submitted itself to the jurisdiction of the ICC. I mean, here they were saying, yeah, go ahead, because that wasn't a big deal. They were already sanctioned. They were already, Gaza was already under, siege and embargo. There was, the discursiveness of what they were doing wasn't in question. And yet now by submitting themselves, they're saying, show us. We're not going to be, show us that the ICC can work, somewhat. Now, I want to say about the ICC, even though it did issue these arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, also because of collective power. I saw a question about, is collective power the goal or the means? And I want to say that it's obviously both. You need collective power in order to triumph. And you can't relinquish collective power after triumph because you must protect a revolution. Otherwise, it's going to be taken away. Your gains will be dismantled. We see that in the rise of Black uprising in the United States, I want to say between 2012 at the height of 2020, right? And then we see that despite this revolution and these advancements, that those revolutionary gains have been now steadily dismantled, where there's an full frontal attack on anything, even less than the radical demands of what the movement was making. But the ICC, since its inception in 2002, of its some 60 indictments, only 6 have not been on the African continent. And of those 6, only 2 have not been, only 2 are would be considered part of the West. And so, yeah, these are all the contradictions we're already working in. It's not, I feel so bad almost for folks who had faith in international law and were like, why doesn't it work here? It's only because it's Palestine. And I'm always like kind of this annoying human. It never worked. Palestine is just making it obvious where nobody's willing to put up, that act anymore. And so what do we do about it now? And I think, in addition to what Jake was saying, we're mobilizing the law in the Hind Rajab Foundation, even as I'm so excited by the work, because even if nobody is prosecuted necessarily in a court as they should be, right? These alleged war criminals cannot, be expected to have rest and leisure. They can't. They have to be outed. They have to answer to a public. They have to become a point of controversy. They cannot, their place of employment has to make a decision on whether they have the actual ethics to be employed. Their community has to make a decision on whether or not they can be part of the community without atonement. It's not that only, the courtroom is going to be the source of justice. How do these people live in the world? If they live in peace and, state of mind where everybody's coddling them, like, great job for hunting Palestinian children and destroying homes, we have failed. And that's not a failure of law. That's our failure as collective and as community. So again, there is I don't want to extricate law from us. We are it. That's it. We're using the law as a tool to the extent that it could be used as a tool, period.
And if I could just add to that, I think it's really important what Jake said, and you both have been saying. It's not just the law, it's us, and part of what our job has to be is to create the environment, the context and the environment, like Jake said, that demands justice, that demands that our governments take action, because it all really does boil down to political will, right? And if we can obviously, continue leveraging, international law and the language of it, but also keep doing what we're doing in terms of shifting public opinion, so that we get to a point someday where people demand that their governments actually take the action that we are demanding them take. So as you can see, we have like a couple more minutes left and some really, really good questions that I do want to get to. Noura, I don't know if you see that first one, kind of directed to you from several students who are in the audience, and they're just wondering. I mean, like,
I don't see a question. I'm sorry. Can you read it to me?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll read it to you. So, for those of us feeling called to work in international law, but know or understand how it could be seen as meaningless, do you have any suggestions for them in terms of finding organizations they believe in and serve, or should they just abandon the academy completely?
Man,
you've gone through all these conversations.
Listen, I think we're at a moment where really we've seen the fallacy of any of these industries that we might enter. I mean, if you think, the law obviously for all of its bankruptcy, but think about the academy, where, even, academic knowledge production and academic freedom is a mockery, right? Where universities are entwined with state violence and acting on its behalf. Where Mark Rowan, who used his position as a trustee of the University of Pennsylvania to attack the students and the protesters and the faculty there, is now a member of the Board of Peace. I mean, it's not, think about journalism. Where are you going to go in journalism and be able to do the work? I mean, really, we're at a moment, and again, Palestine has made this more clear. The fallacy, the idea that we can just somehow make things work. We have to understand, and Dylan Saba does this really well, who's also a co-author with Jake. I encourage you to read their article together, but he had a recent article on fugitive solidarities where he ties the stories of Assata Shakur, George Jackson, Yahya Sinwar, and Ghassan Kanafani. And what's really clear there, right, is that there is a war that has been declared on us. How do we respond in a moment of warfare that has been declared on us? And a war in this moment, that declaration of war on Palestinians has also been demonstrated that they're willing to win that war through genocide. How do we respond knowing that? So this idea of where do I go and I want to be the most effective, it's a war, period. You're not going to escape. We're in it. You can work outside, you can work inside, wherever you are. You have to be working knowing that these are the conditions that have been set against us. So where is your loyalty? If your loyalty is to your job and to your professional ascendance, and to, if you're quiet enough, maybe you'll get that promotion, you've been co-opted, right? But if your loyalty is to the people that you want to fight for, whether you're in the academy or in journalism, or forget the people if you don't want to think about even the principles that you want to fight for, right? Then you will know how to use the tools available to you to move forward. We are weaker in this war because we are not equivalent in the type of economic military or political weaponry available to us. We're weaker. We have to be moving through it like guerrillas. And guerrilla warfare is predicated on the concept that you turn your adversary's strengths into weaknesses, and you turn your weaknesses into strengths wherever you go, whatever you do. So for those who want to enter international law, yeah, do it, but do it well. Do it ingeniously. Do it not to win a decision in the courtroom, right? Which is what we see a lot of lawyers try to do. They drop all of the political work. This would go directly against what Rob Knox was advising, using it revolutionary, right? Like, think about the apartheid reports that came out in 2020 and 2021. Or was it 2021, 2022? Excuse me. Great advancements. We needed it, right? But those reports were flawed because they were so concerned with winning in the courtroom that they wanted to demonstrate apartheid. They wanted to demonstrate an intent to dominate, but they focused so much on that judicial win that they dropped a critique of racism, Zionism, and colonialism from the analysis. Don't do it like that. Go into the field that you're going to go in as a way to think, how am I going to use the space and the tools available to me in order to advance the principles I believe in, right? And so good luck. Power to you. We're doing it together. You're not doing it alone. Do not be, you're going to be disenchanted. Do not make that let you quit, right? Our Palestinians have had the entire world collude against them for over 100 years. They have not surrendered. We have no right to surrender. So,
thanks, Noura. I think that's a good place for us to end. Thank you both. Thank you, Noura. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Before we sign off, just want to remind everyone that these labs are a crowdfunded part of Shabaka, and we'd be super thankful for any donations you can make. You should see a little button appear in the bottom. But thanks for coming, and stay tuned for our discussion next month and the month following and every month to come. Thank you again, Noura and Jake. I thought this was an amazing conversation.
Thank you, Tarek. And everyone who listened. Yeah.
Thank you both. I learned a lot. Thanks. Thanks to both of you.